The day started like any other travel day. The FSA director had an early morning flight to catch after wrapping up an important international summit. He wasn't the type to rush things at the last moment, so he arrived at the airport well before his departure time. The air outside was crisp, and inside the terminal the usual mix of travelers moved quickly with their luggage, some excited for holidays and others lost in thought about work. For him, this was just another journey, one of many that his position demanded. Nothing about the morning suggested that it would soon turn into a scene that he would never forget. He walked with calm steps through the check-in counter, passport and boarding pass in hand. The staff at the counter recognized his position and greeted him politely. Everything seemed normal. He had traveled countless times before, and the routine had become second nature. He had nothing to hide, nothing to worry about. He placed his bag on the belt, smiled at the attendant, and proceeded toward the security checkpoint like everyone else. But this time, something felt different. As soon as he reached the security gate, one of the officers gave him a long look, as if analyzing him more closely than the other passengers. He didn't think much of it at first. Airport staff often scanned travelers carefully. But then another officer joined, whispered something, and suddenly the air shifted. The casual process that usually lasted only a few seconds stretched into silence. The officer scanned his boarding pass again and asked him to step aside. He raised his eyebrows, confused but still calm. "Is there a problem?" he asked politely. The officer didn't give a clear answer, only saying, "Just a quick routine check." He was guided toward a separate lane, away from the regular crowd. Travelers around him started to notice. Some glanced curiously, others whispered to each other. For someone of his standing, this was unexpected and to some extent humiliating, but he didn't resist. He simply followed instructions, confident that it would be resolved in a matter of minutes. The minutes stretched longer. Instead of letting him through after a simple check, 2 more officers approached and stood on either side of him. Their body language wasn't casual anymore. It was firm, almost as if they were escorting someone under suspicion. He felt his heart beat a little faster. This wasn't the usual process. Something was off. He asked again, "May I know what's happening?" But the officer only replied, "Sir, please cooperate. We'll explain soon." His belongings were pulled aside and every item was scanned separately. They flipped through his passport, checked each page, and even questioned why he had visited certain countries in the past. He calmly explained. It was all related to his work, meetings, conferences, official trips that had always been cleared through proper channels. Still, their expressions didn't soften. After several minutes, they asked him to follow them to a private room. At this point, a few nearby travelers had already taken out their phones, recording or snapping quick photos. He noticed it but didn't react. The last thing he wanted was to create a scene. Quietly, he walked with the officers, his mind racing to understand what could have triggered this. Inside the holding room, the environment was stark. A plain table, 2 chairs, and a small camera fixed in the corner. He sat down as instructed. One officer remained standing by the door, while another placed a file on the table. It was unusual. He was used to answering formal questions in conference halls and boardrooms, but never under suspicion in an airport security room. The officer finally spoke. "Sir, we have reason to believe that there may be inconsistencies with your travel documents." The words hit him like a sudden wave. Inconsistencies? That seemed impossible. His documents were always handled through official government channels, verified multiple times before every trip. He immediately handed over his identification again, pointing out the seals, the stamps, the approvals. Everything was authentic, yet the officer's tone remained cold. For the first time, he felt a sting of helplessness. He had worked for years building his reputation, serving in one of the most respected positions in the agency. And now in a small room with no explanation, he was being treated like a suspect. His phone had been taken away temporarily, cutting off his contact with his staff. He sat there, wondering how quickly rumors could spread if anyone recognized him and posted online. Every minute in that room felt longer than it actually was. The officers asked repetitive questions. Where are you coming from? What was the purpose of your visit? Why did you travel to certain regions? He answered each patiently, even though inside he was frustrated. He reminded himself to stay calm. Losing his temper would only make things worse. At one point, he looked at the officer and said, "I have served this country for decades. I respect this procedure, but please understand the weight of what you're doing. You're detaining me without cause." His voice was controlled but firm. The officer avoided direct eye contact, flipping through the passport again as if searching for something that wasn't there. Meanwhile, outside the room, word began to spread among the airport staff. Some employees who had seen him earlier at the counter now whispered to each other about the unusual treatment. A few were puzzled. How could someone of his position be under suspicion? Still, the officers carried on, convinced that their system had flagged him for a reason. He leaned back in the chair, drawing a deep breath. He thought about his family waiting for him back home, his team that trusted him, and the important project still on his desk. This was not how his day was supposed to go. This was not how a person in his position should be treated. Yet here he was, powerless in a plain room waiting for someone to realize the mistake. The silence grew heavier. The clicking of a pen, the shuffling of papers, and the sound of distant announcements in the airport were the only things breaking it. He sat straight, his dignity intact, but inside a storm was brewing. How could a simple journey turn into this? What he didn't know was that outside this small room, calls were already being made. His absence had been noticed. People from his office were trying to reach him. And soon, the very same officers who had held him with suspicion would find themselves facing a truth they hadn't expected. But for now, inside that room, he remained the picture of patience, confused, humiliated but steady. He knew one thing: the truth always came out, and when it did, it would change everything about this morning. The room felt smaller with every passing minute. The director sat quietly, his documents still lying on the table. Across from him, one officer kept flipping pages of his passport while another tapped at a computer screen, entering details over and over. It was clear they were searching for something to confirm the suspicion that had landed him there. But the more they looked, the less they seemed to find. Finally, one of them leaned forward and asked, "Do you know why you've been stopped today?" The director gave a calm but tired smile. "No, I don't. That's what I've been waiting to hear from you." The officer lowered his voice and said, "You've been flagged in our system. It shows your documents may not be authentic." The words sounded unreal. Him, carrying false documents? The thought was almost insulting. He had traveled internationally for years, all with official clearance, never once questioned at any checkpoint. He gently placed his hand on the passport and said, "Every page here has been cleared by government protocol. Every stamp you see is legitimate. I think there has been some mistake." But the officers weren't convinced. One of them even began comparing the passport with a sample book, checking the thickness of the paper, holding it under a light to see the watermark. Watching this, the director couldn't help but feel a wave of disbelief. How could such a misunderstanding happen to him of all people? He was not just any traveler. He was someone trusted with national responsibilities, someone whose identity was always verified through secure channels. Yet here he was, sitting like an ordinary suspect, his words carrying little weight. For the first time in his career, he felt what it was like to be on the other side of authority, questioned, doubted, and treated with suspicion. It was not only frustrating but also humiliating. The officers continued with their questions, moving from his travel documents to his recent trips. Why did you visit that country last month? What was your business there? Who did you meet? The questions came in a sharp tone, as if every answer he gave would be twisted into something else. He patiently explained each trip, repeating that all visits were official, backed by clear approvals. But his calmness didn't soften their doubt. At one point, he leaned forward and said firmly, "Do you realize who you are speaking to? I'm the director of the FSA. My movements are not personal whims. They are matters of state." His voice carried quiet authority, but instead of respect, one officer only replied coldly, "Everyone is equal at security, sir. If there are doubts, they must be cleared." That sentence struck him deeply. Yes, everyone should be equal under the law. But equality didn't mean ignoring obvious truth. He was being accused of dishonesty when his record stood spotless. He sat back in silence, realizing that no matter what he said, these officers weren't ready to believe him. Meanwhile, outside the room, the ripple effect of his detention was beginning to spread. His staff had been waiting for his call, but his phone had gone silent. Messages went unanswered, and soon the concern grew. A call was placed to a senior official who had been traveling with him earlier, and within minutes the network of colleagues started moving. If he wasn't answering, something had to be wrong. Back inside, the questions grew sharper. Have you ever used another identity? Do you know anyone who could have tampered with your documents? Are you carrying anything you haven't declared? The director almost laughed at the absurdity. Tampered documents? Other identities? I don't think you understand what you're suggesting, he replied. His voice, though calm, carried clear irritation. One officer leaned closer, lowering his tone. Sir, if you are hiding something, it will come out eventually. If you cooperate now, it will be easier for you. That was the moment when the director realized how deeply the officers were convinced. In their eyes, he wasn't an innocent man wrongly detained. He was someone caught with a secret. He folded his hands on the table, looked directly at them, and said, I have given you every answer truthfully. My documents are real. My record is clear. The mistake is not mine. It is in your system. His words were steady, but inside he felt the weight of injustice pressing down on him. The officers exchanged glances, perhaps sensing his confidence. But rather than stopping, they decided to dig deeper. They pulled out forms, began filling out official notes, and even mentioned the possibility of holding him longer for further verification. That thought made his chest tighten. Being delayed for an hour was one thing. Being officially held would be a completely different matter, one that could damage his reputation if it became public. As the process dragged on, his frustration slowly turned into quiet reflection. For years he had overseen policies, signed off on procedures, and spoken about the importance of security systems. And now, those very systems had turned against him. It was a strange, bitter irony. He thought of the ordinary travelers who might have gone through similar experiences without the resources or connections to defend themselves. For them, such moments must feel endless, terrifying, and unfair. Now he understood their pain in a way he never had before. Back outside, things were moving fast. His absence at the boarding gate raised alarms. The airline staff, noticing the unusual situation, alerted senior airport officials. Soon, a quiet buzz spread across the terminal that an important figure was being held inside security. People who recognized him whispered in disbelief. How could someone of his stature be detained like this? Inside the room, the officer's confidence began to waver slightly. Every answer the director gave matched official records. Nothing suspicious was turning up, no matter how hard they checked. But still, the system alert hung over their heads like a warning they couldn't ignore. They didn't want to admit the possibility that their system could be wrong. The director, though outwardly composed, was running out of patience. He had kept his dignity intact, but the idea of missing his flight, of being wrongly recorded as a suspect, made him restless. He leaned forward once again and said, You have kept me here long enough. If you truly believe I am guilty, show me proof. If not, let me leave. The room fell into silence for a moment. The officers avoided eye contact, still shuffling papers, still searching screens. But in that silence, the truth was beginning to creep in. The truth that they may have made a serious mistake. What none of them realized was that outside, calls had already reached the highest levels. Officials in different departments were now aware that the FSA director had been stopped. Messages were flying between offices, confirming his credentials and demanding answers. The situation was no longer confined to a small airport room. It was spreading. And soon the officers inside would be forced to face a reality they had not expected. But in that moment, for the director, all that existed was the quiet frustration of being wrongfully accused, the disbelief of sitting under suspicion, and the growing weight of humiliation as time ticked away. He kept his eyes steady, his voice calm, but inside he knew one thing. When this ended, it would not be a simple apology. It would be something much larger. The tension in the small airport room was getting heavier with every passing minute. The director sat upright, hands folded neatly in front of him, his face calm but his mind restless. He had explained everything a dozen times, shown his documents, and even reminded the officers of his official position, but they still weren't convinced. The room smelled faintly of coffee and stress, a mix of uncertainty and authority clashing in silence. On the other side of the door, life at the airport continued as usual. Announcements about boarding, the rolling of luggage wheels on polished floors, children tugging at their parents' hands, all of it moved forward without anyone realizing that in one corner of the airport, A powerful man was being treated like a common suspect. But outside that room, the ripple had begun. His team, who had been waiting at another part of the airport, had grown increasingly worried. They hadn't heard from him in more than an hour, which was unusual. The director was known for being punctual and always keeping his staff informed. Silence was unlike him. Calls to his phone went unanswered and text messages remained unread. That was the first real sign to them that something was wrong. One of his assistants decided to approach an airport staff member, asking discreetly if they knew where the director had gone after security. The staff hesitated at first, but finally admitted he had been taken aside by officers. That was enough to set alarms ringing. Word quickly spread to senior members of his office, and soon phones were buzzing in different government departments. A high-ranking official had been stopped at the airport, and no one could explain why. Back in the room, the officers continued their questioning. They weren't aggressive, but their doubt was firm. "Why does your travel record show repeated visits to restricted areas?" one of them asked. The director responded patiently, "Because that's where my work takes me." Every visit was official and recorded. If you check with the proper departments, you'll see. But the officers weren't ready to call anyone. They relied only on the screen in front of them, and that screen showed a red flag. The director felt the weight of irony. He had spent years improving systems and making sure checks were reliable. And now, because of one error, he was sitting in front of people who treated him as if his word had no value. He couldn't decide whether to be angry or simply disappointed. Meanwhile, the calls outside reached higher. A message landed on the desk of one of his close colleagues, who immediately contacted airport headquarters. Questions began to pile up. Why was the director being detained? What evidence was there? Who authorized it? The officials at the top demanded quick answers, but the officers in that small room still had no idea that their actions were about to backfire. The director's absence had also caught the attention of the airline staff. Boarding for his flight was about to begin, but his name hadn't been checked off the list. When the airline tried to contact him, they learned he was still with security. That unusual detail reached the ears of the airport's senior manager, who now faced a dilemma. If something went wrong, it wouldn't just be an inconvenience, it would be a scandal. Inside the room, the questioning had started to slow down. The officers repeated the same doubts, but their eyes gave away something different now. They were uncertain, and the firmness from earlier was fading. They hadn't found a single piece of solid evidence to justify the detention. Still, none of them wanted to admit it. Admitting it meant admitting the system was flawed. The director noticed the change. He leaned back slightly and spoke in a steady voice. "You've kept me here long enough. I told you from the beginning that I am innocent. If you check with your seniors, you'll realize it quickly, but the longer you delay, the worse this will look for all of us." His words carried quiet authority, and for the first time, one of the officers hesitated. At that very moment, the door opened. A different officer walked in holding a small folder. He whispered something into the ear of the man at the table, and the expression on the officer's face shifted almost immediately. It wasn't relief, it was alarm. The director couldn't hear the words, but he could sense the sudden change in mood. The folder contained urgent information. Calls from senior government offices had already reached the airport command center, demanding an explanation for the director's detention. Higher authorities were now involved, and the officers were beginning to realize that this was no ordinary case. The officer cleared his throat nervously and tried to keep his voice calm. "Sir, we are just doing our job. You understand we cannot take risks with security." The director met his eyes and replied firmly, "Yes, I understand. But what you fail to see is that the real risk here is not me. It is the mistake you are making." The words hit harder than they expected. By now, even the officers in the room were unsure about continuing. They shuffled papers, avoided eye contact, and typed half-heartedly on the computer. The certainty from before had crumbled. Meanwhile, outside the airport, news of the detention was spreading quietly. Journalists hadn't picked it up yet, but officials in government circles were already whispering. Some were shocked, others furious. How could the director be treated this way? Wasn't there a system to prevent such errors? Questions grew louder with every phone call. The director sat silently, watching the officers struggle with their own mistake. He wasn't gloating, but inside he knew the tide was turning. He could almost feel the balance of power shifting back into his favor. It was only a matter of time before the door opened again, this time not for questioning but for an apology. One of the officers excused himself and left the room, leaving two others behind. They stood awkwardly, their voices softer than before. The director noticed the nervous tapping of fingers, the uncomfortable shifting in chairs. These were small signs, but to him they were proof that the truth was finally breaking through. And then it happened. A senior official from the airport authority entered the room, his face tense. He carried himself with a mix of authority and urgency. He greeted the director with a polite nod and said, "Sir, I believe we may have made an error. We are working to clear it right away." Those words felt like a door opening after hours of being locked in. The director didn't react with anger. He simply looked at the man and replied calmly, "I told you this was a mistake." The officers in the room lowered their heads slightly, avoiding eye contact. They hadn't apologized yet, but their silence spoke louder than words. For the first time since the ordeal began, the director felt the weight lifting off his chest. It wasn't over yet, but he knew the truth was now on his side. What he didn't know, however, was just how far this mistake had already reached. Calls were still bouncing between offices, demands for answers were still being made, and the story was growing bigger with every passing minute. What started as a wrongful detention inside one airport room was about to turn into a national issue, one that would leave the officers not just embarrassed, but begging for forgiveness. For now, though, the director sat quietly, waiting for the final confirmation of his release. His patience had been tested, his dignity challenged, but his belief in the truth remained firm. And that truth was finally beginning to surface piece by piece. The air in the room shifted after the senior airport official walked in. His words, "We may have made an error," were simple, but they carried weight. For the first time since the entire ordeal began, the director could feel the authority in the room leaning back toward him. Still, the situation wasn't completely over. The officers who had questioned him were shuffling papers nervously, pretending to stay busy, but the doubt in their faces was obvious. The director sat calmly, his hands resting on the table. He had endured hours of suspicion, repeated questions, and silent humiliation. Now, with the truth starting to come out, he chose not to explode in anger. Instead, he waited, composed, his silence louder than any argument he could make. It was the silence of someone who knew time was about to reveal everything. The senior official asked the officers to step outside for a moment. When the door closed, he sat across from the director, lowering his voice. "Sir, I must apologize. It seems there was a clerical error in the system. Your profile was wrongly flagged. We are verifying details right now to correct it." The director nodded slowly, his expression steady. "I knew from the beginning this was a mistake. But the time I've spent here, do you realize what this means?" His tone wasn't angry. It was controlled, but each word carried the weight of disappointment. The official bowed his head slightly. "I understand, sir. We will fix this immediately." Meanwhile, outside the small room, a storm was brewing. Calls from the director's office had already reached top government departments. Senior figures were demanding explanations, and the airport authority was under heavy pressure. The mistake was no longer hidden. It was climbing its way up the chain of command. The officers who had carried out the questioning were now being spoken to by their seniors. One of them protested. "The system showed a red flag. We only followed protocol." But the senior staff didn't want excuses. "You should have verified before detaining someone of his rank. Do you understand the seriousness of this?" The officers lowered their heads, realizing the situation had gone far beyond a simple misunderstanding. Inside, the director sat patiently. He wasn't eager to leave just yet. He wanted to see how the airport staff would handle the mistake they had made. His silence was deliberate. It forced them to acknowledge their fault rather than rushing him out quietly. Minutes later, the door opened again. This time, a group of higher-ranking officials entered. Their faces carried worry, even fear. They greeted him respectfully, some with small nods, others with uneasy smiles. One of them spoke first. "Sir, we deeply regret what has happened. It was never our intention to cause you any discomfort. Please accept our sincere apologies." The director listened without reacting immediately. He let the words settle in the air. The same people who had held him under suspicion just hours ago were now speaking to him with folded hands and lowered eyes. It was a complete reversal. And though he didn't take joy in it, he knew the lesson it carried. Finally, he replied, "I accept your apology. But do you understand the gravity of this? If this can happen to me, imagine what happens to ordinary travelers who don't have the means to defend themselves." His words struck deep. The officials shifted uncomfortably. They knew he was right. For every high-profile mistake like this, countless unknown travelers might have faced the same treatment, only without the influence or resources to clear their name. The room fell silent for a few moments. Then one official promised, "We will conduct a full review of the system. This will not happen again." Another added, "We will personally ensure that your record is cleared from the system today." As the director listened, his mind drifted to the irony of the situation. He had spent years working on policies, on building trust in institutions, on showing the public that systems were reliable. And yet here he was, a victim of the very flaws he had tried to prevent. Outside the room, word had spread among airport staff. Workers whispered to one another, shocked that the director had been detained. Some were embarrassed, others sympathetic. A few staff members even looked in his direction as he finally stepped out of the holding room, their eyes filled with a mix of guilt and respect. The man they had seen escorted inside hours ago was now walking out with quiet dignity, surrounded by officials who trailed him like students following a teacher. But the matter wasn't ending at the airport. News of the mistake had reached higher offices. By evening, meetings were already being planned to address the issue. The detention of such an important figure had sparked urgent conversations about accountability and the reliability of security checks. People wanted answers, and the airport authority had no choice but to prepare them. The director, however, remained calm. He wasn't the type to shout or demand punishment. His greatest weapon was his composure. That day he didn't need to raise his voice. Their fear of what they had done was enough. When one officer finally gathered the courage to speak directly to him, his voice trembled. "Sir, we are truly sorry. Please forgive us. We were only following what the system showed. We never meant disrespect." The director looked at him steadily and replied, "I understand you were following the system, but you must also learn that blind trust in a system without human judgment can destroy people's lives." The officer lowered his eyes, ashamed. Those words would stay with him long after the day was over. As the director left the airport later, the mood around him was strikingly different from when he had been escorted into that room. Where there had once been suspicion and doubt, now there was apology and respect. The very officers who had questioned him now stood in stiff postures, their faces carrying silent regret. He didn't gloat, didn't make a dramatic exit. He simply walked with calm steps, his dignity intact, while the people behind him carried the weight of their mistake. What none of them knew was how deeply this single incident would echo. It was not just about one man being wrongfully detained. It was about what the mistake revealed, the flaws in the system, the need for better checks, and the importance of treating every traveler with dignity. The officers who had doubted him would later admit that those hours were some of the most difficult of their careers. They had acted with authority, but authority without care had led them into a storm, and now, with their apologies barely covering their fear, they realized the full scale of their error. For the director, the experience became more than just a personal insult. It was a mirror showing the cracks in a system he had trusted, and while he forgave the officers, he knew forgiveness alone was not enough. There would have to be change, not just for him, but for everyone who stepped into an airport hoping for fair treatment. The incident was now out of their hands. It had reached people who would not let it fade quietly, and soon, the same police officers and officials who had doubted him would find themselves in a position they had never expected, begging not just for his forgiveness, but for the forgiveness of an entire nation watching closely. The director walked out of the airport with calm steps, but behind that calmness was the weight of everything that had just happened. Hours of humiliation, suspicion, and silence were now replaced with apologies, nervous faces, and uneasy respect. The officers who had once doubted his every word now stood on the other side, ashamed and restless, afraid of the storm that was about to follow. The ride back from the airport was unusually quiet. His staff sat with him, too nervous to speak. They kept glancing at him, trying to read his expression, but he gave them nothing. He stared out of the window, his mind replaying the entire scene from the airport room, The questions, the cold stares, the way his passport had been held under suspicion, as if it belonged to a stranger. He had faced international negotiations, political debates, and difficult decisions in his career, but that small interrogation room had tested his patience in a way nothing else had. By the time he reached his office, the story had already spread across government circles. Senior officials were calling not to question him but to express shock and concern. Some were angry at the airport authority, while others were worried about how the public would react if the full story became known. Meetings were set up immediately. The director, however, didn't rush to speak. He knew silence sometimes carried more power than words. Later that evening, a group of high-ranking police officers arrived at his office. They were not dressed in their usual firm, confident manner. Instead, their shoulders were slightly bent, their expressions heavy. They walked into the room carefully, as if each step carried guilt. The director looked at them from across his desk, his face calm, waiting. The first officer spoke, his voice low. "Sir, we have come to apologize in person. The mistake was ours, and we deeply regret what happened today." His words trembled slightly, not from fear of punishment, but from the awareness that they had humiliated a man who didn't deserve it. The director listened without interrupting. The silence in the room made the apology heavier. Another officer added, "We were following what the system showed, but we understand now that we should have handled it differently. We are asking for your forgiveness." The director finally spoke, his tone firm but not harsh. "Do you know what I kept thinking about while I sat in that room? I wasn't thinking of myself. I was thinking of ordinary people who don't have the position I hold. If they are detained wrongly, who will speak for them? Who will demand answers for them?" The officers shifted uncomfortably. They had no reply. They knew that he was right. For every one powerful person who could clear his name, there were countless ordinary travelers who had no choice but to suffer in silence. The director leaned forward slightly. "You humiliated me, yes, but more than that. You exposed the weakness of a system that is supposed to protect, not harm. And for that, an apology is not enough. There must be change." One officer, perhaps the most senior among them, finally lowered his head completely and said, "Sir, please forgive us. We beg you to believe that we will learn from this. We cannot change what happened, but we can promise it will never happen again." His voice cracked slightly as he spoke, and for a moment the room felt heavy with the weight of regret. The director studied their faces. These were not arrogant men now. They were not the firm officers who had questioned him with cold suspicion hours earlier. They were just human beings who had realized the magnitude of their mistake. He could see the guilt in their eyes, and in that moment, he understood something important. Power could make anyone confident, but mistakes had the ability to strip away that confidence and leave only humility behind. He sat back, taking a deep breath, and then finally said, "I forgive you, but forgiveness does not mean forgetting. I will not allow this to disappear quietly. What happened today must be used as an example to fix what is broken." The officers nodded quickly, relief washing over their faces, though the shame remained. They promised once again to issue a full review, to correct the errors in the system, and to ensure no one else would suffer the same treatment. Before leaving, one officer almost whispered, "Thank you, sir. We don't deserve your patience, but we are grateful for it." As they left, the director remained in his chair, silent once more. Forgiveness had been given, but his mind was already on the larger picture. This incident was no longer just about him. It was about accountability, fairness, and the dignity of every traveler. He had the influence to demand change, and he knew he would use it. In the days that followed, the story gained more attention. Though it wasn't shouted in headlines immediately, the whispers grew louder. People spoke about how even the director of the FSA had been wrongfully detained. If it could happen to him, it could happen to anyone. The debate spread through offices, government meetings, and even ordinary conversations among citizens. The director chose his words carefully whenever he spoke about it. He never exaggerated, never dramatized, but his simple retelling of the events carried more power than anything else. People were shocked not because he was treated unfairly, but because his calm dignity highlighted the flaws that could affect anyone. For the officers involved, the memory of that day stayed with them. They had once acted with confidence, but their mistake had humbled them in front of the very person they had wronged. Their apologies had been sincere, their regret genuine. They had begged for forgiveness, and though they had received it, They knew their reputations would always carry the shadow of that incident. For the director, it became more than just a personal story. It became a reminder that systems were only as strong as the people who ran them. It reminded him that humility mattered more than authority, and that patience in the face of injustice could sometimes achieve more than anger ever could. And so, the story closed not with loud punishment, but with quiet reflection. The officers had begged for forgiveness and received it. The director had chosen dignity over rage, and the nation had been given a mirror, showing the cracks that needed to be repaired. What happened that day at the airport was not just about a man being detained. It was about humanity, responsibility, and the power of truth to break through even the strongest walls of doubt. And though the director walked away with his dignity intact, the officers walked away with a lesson they would never forget. Authority is temporary, but respect, and the lack of it, can echo for a lifetime.